It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Professor Edward Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University. And he's taught there since 1992. He's also the director of the Tubman Center for State and Local Government, and he's the director of the Rappaport Institute of Greater Boston. His fields are quite diverse, ranging from microeconomic theory to urban and public economics, and it's an understatement to say that he is a legendary scholar and thought leader in the field of urban economics. His work is focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as a center of ideas transmission. And I have been a great fan of Professor Glaeser's work, and in particular, his book, The Triumph of the City, to my mind, is one of the must-reads that everybody in this audience, if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend you go out and read it. And the New York Times has talked about it as, describes it as his research into the role of cities in fostering human achievement, and is at once polymathic and vibrant. And I usually always agree with the New York Times, and in this particular instance, I certainly agree with the New York Times. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Ed Glaeser, but before he comes on stage, let's all very loudly say, happy birthday, Ed.
Thank you very much for those kind words. Sure. Really, I'm terribly honored to be here. I can't think of a better way to spend my birthday than to be with you talking about inclusive cities. Gandhi famously said, the future of the nation lies not in cities, but in its villages. But with all due respect to the great man, on this one he was completely and totally wrong. That in fact the future of India does not lie in its villages, but it lies in Delhi and Mumbai and Kolkata, in places that are providing pathways out of poverty into prosperity. And that is, of course, happening throughout the world. This does not in any sense mean to suggest that our cities are perfect or that there isn't a tremendous challenge ahead of us. And that's why I'm so glad we're here today talking about the inclusive city. Because, in fact, while the power of the city to hypercharge human achievement, to create enormous prosperity, is well proven, the ability of the cities to enable everyone to participate in that is not. And indeed, in the West, we have problems where our cities are too expensive, at risk of turning into boutique towns affordable only to the rich. We have issues looking at urban economies built upon skill that are, wonderfully productive. I mean, look at the Boston that surrounds us, but not necessarily great in ensuring that everyone can participate in those economies of intellect. In the developing world, the challenge is also inclusivity in the economy, but it's even more basic. It's ensuring safety. It's ensuring health. It's ensuring that those demons that so often plague dense areas do not prove to be absolutely awful to the poorer citizens of the cities of India and elsewhere. The scope of challenge in the world is just enormous. And this profoundly ugly graph behind me is one way of looking at that challenge. And I promise you it all gets better after this one. But it is also true that I'm aesthetically challenged in many ways. But what this is along the x-axis is urbanization in 1960, and along the y-axis is urbanization in 2010. The red line that you see is the 45-degree line. So any dot that's above that red line is a dot that has increased its urbanization level between 1960 and 2010. So what you can see is a country like Gabon has gone from being 20% urbanized in 1960 to being over 80% urbanized today. Almost all of these lines, with the exception of Tajikistan and Trinidad and Tobago, are above the line, right? And many of them are really enormously above the line. Really, the transformation is incredible. And of course, it was not so long ago, in 2007, that the UN declared that we are an urban species, that more than 50% of humanity lives in urban areas. And on net, it's hard not to think that that's a good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are on average 5 times higher, and in some sense, even more importantly, infant mortality levels that are less than 1/3. The connection between urbanization and income is a well-established one. Economists refer to this as agglomeration economies, the advantages of being around other people. And of course, when you look at the connection between earnings and density, there are many possible explanations for it. It may just be that people are coming to areas that are naturally productive. It may be, in fact, that there's something else about this area that actually causes the connection between density and productivity. But my own belief is, looking at the past 40 years of economics research, that actually a fair amount of this connection actually represents a treatment effect of being in dense areas. And this is what you can see in one of the two graphs one of the two lines that you see behind you. What I've done is I've taken the 3,000-odd counties in the United States, and I've organized them on the basis of their density levels. For at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. What the top line shows is that as you move to more and more dense areas within the United States, family incomes go up and up and up. The densest tenth of America's counties have incomes that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. The three largest metropolitan areas in the US produce 18% of America's GDP, while including only 13% of America's population. Now, the bottom line shows a fact that is perhaps somewhat more surprising, which is the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 and population density as of the year 2000. And that one you can also see, sorry, that's the red line. The blue line is the income one. The red line shows, again, until you get to the top tenth, a monotonic relationship between initial density and population growth, and even the densest tenth is growing much more quickly than the least dense of America's counties. So whereas at the start of the 19th century we were leaving our dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. Now, this is not at all a particularly US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. This is the same graph with exactly the same two figures for the European Union. The blue line is GDP per capita, which actually has a significantly higher relationship. It's about 2 to 1 between the densest tenth of these areas and the least dense tenth. And the red line shows population change 2000 to 2010 and initial population density. This is a very common phenomenon, that in fact the dense areas are growing, in part largely because they are more productive. This is the relationship between earnings and density in the US. This is green, India, this is orange, and this is China, China is saffron, which of course is a complete screw-up because India should be saffron, but, and this is India. And as you can see, the density relationship between density and earnings is much stronger in India and China than it is in the United States. That in these areas, there really is a huge gulf between productivity and earnings in dense areas and in less dense areas. Now, the critics of urbanization in the developing world will particularly emphasize that while cities may be economically productive, they will point to the slums of Mumbai or Kinshasa, and they will say, yes, but look at what's being lost in these areas. Look at the charming, bucolic pleasures that are completely absent in these dense areas. Well, I would argue that anyone who makes that argument has not been to rural India any time lately, or the rural Democratic Republic of the Congo either. Because, in fact, when you look at the subnational data, there's a huge gulf in terms of almost everything that you look at between rural and urban areas. It's not that, in fact, these urbanites are somehow or other losing in terms of health or happiness. This is the relationship between self-reported life satisfaction and urbanization across countries in the world. People who live in more urbanized countries say that they are significantly happier than those people who live in less urbanized countries. And this survives controlling for income levels. When you look within countries, in the wealthy world, there's no connection between living in a big urban area and self-reported life satisfaction or happiness. In fact, New Yorkers are particularly prone to say that they are unhappy in the US. This will come to no surprise to anyone who has ever been to New York, as indeed it takes no New Yorker is going to admit to a survey that they're so pleased with their life, right? But indeed, in the developing world, there really is a huge gap. If you look at India, there's a massive gap between self-reported life satisfaction in urban areas and in non-urban areas. And that's the starting point, that when we see the problems, the very real challenges of developing world megacities, we have to remember what the alternative is. And there's just no future in rural poverty. There's no solution to these problems that involve artificially restricting the size of cities. The only path forward is to invest in ways that actually make these cities more livable. And one thing I think that's really crucial to remember is that when we see urban poverty, when we see favelas, we have to remember that the poor aren't in cities because the cities made these people poor. The poor come to cities. They are attracted by urban density because of the promise of a brighter life, because of better social services. In the US, it's because of the access to public transportation. My work with Matthew Kahn finds that poverty rates rise near new subway stops. This doesn't mean that those subway stops are impoverishing the people who live near them. It means that people who don't want to own a car for every adult, right, which is what's required in exurban America, come to areas where they have access to have public transportation. In some sense, this leads you to the strange argument that actually cities should never apologize for their inequality. While inequality at the national and global level is hugely problematic, the fact that both poor and rich people come to live in cities is actually showing signs of urban strength, not urban weakness. The areas that should be apologizing are those suburban areas that make no room for the poor, that actually don't have inequality precisely because you can only be one sort of person and live in these areas. Whereas the fact that cities are unequal is actually just another way of saying that cities are diverse, and that's not something that they should be apologizing for. Now, in some sense, this relatively rosy picture of cities provides us with a paradox. We live in an age in which distance is dead, in which any of us could effortlessly telecommute in from whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia. And yet, in so many ways, in so many places throughout the world, we choose the inconveniences of city life. Why is it that the cyberseers and technoprophets who predicted in the 1980s that the rise of information technology would make face-to-face contact, and the cities that enable that contact, why is it that they were wrong? Why is it that we didn't just disperse? Why is it that urbanization remains so vital both in the wealthy cities of the West and in the growing cities of the East? In some sense, the success of those cities is something of a surprise given the New York that I grew up in. These are two iconic images from the city of my youth. President Ford actually didn't tell New York to drop dead, but certainly the editors of the Daily News thought he meant to say it. And indeed, in those years, it didn't just seem as if Ford, but history itself was telling the older, colder cities of America to head for the trash heap, that their age was done. New York had the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s. Larger than automobile production in Detroit was the garment cluster in New York. It was a cluster that was hammered by globalization during the 1960s. Hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs lost over a 5-year period. Accompanying the deindustrialization of the cities was social distress. Crime rates skyrocketed between 1960 and 1975 in many of our urban areas. The combination of rising social problems and diminishing economic resources because of deindustrialization meant a fiscal crisis in America's cities, and that's indeed what Ford is responding to, New York's request that the federal government bail New York out. In those years, in the top image is Ford's successor, Jimmy Carter, wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become, where it really seemed as if the weeds were about to come up and reclaim the towers that had once come out of the city, and there really would be a future in which the Statue of Liberty would one day poke out of the sand as it does in the end of the Planet of the Apes, that these cities were just a detour that humanity had made, and it was a mistaken one, and the future would just be cars and Sunbelt suburbs forever. In some sense, the plight of the city in the 1970s felt so bleak because the original reason for being of the cities of the West had come and gone. If you look at all of America's older, colder cities, they were formed on major waterways. The 20 largest cities in the U.S. in 1900 are all on water, from the oldest, typically where the river meets the sea, like New York and Boston, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. They were on water for a very natural reason. In 1816, it cost as much to ship goods 30 miles over land as it did to send them across the entire Atlantic Ocean. Distance was tyranny. And over the course of the 19th century, Americans had to grapple with this problem that we sat on the edge of this incredibly wealthy continent, and yet that wealth was virtually inaccessible because distances were so difficult to navigate. Over that century, we built this amazing transportation network. First and most importantly, canals, and then the railroads that supplemented the canals. And cities rose up on pinch points of that watery network, like the westernmost terminus of the Erie Canal, where Buffalo rose, like Chicago, the linchpin of a great watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans. And industries, of course, clustered around those transportation hubs. New York's 3 great industries were printing and publishing, garment production, and sugar refining. These were all children of the port. Sugar refining there because a huge amount of trade was done with the Caribbean, and you couldn't refine sugar, as you can today, at the point of growing sugar cane, because refined sugar crystals would coalesce during a long, hot sea voyage north. So you had to refine near the point of production. So fortunes like Isaac Roosevelt's, the family fortune that would eventually put FDR in the White House, were made in urban manufacturing, made in urban sugar refining. Garment production was there, of course, because of the large number of customers, both the seafarers and also customers in more distant places who would take advantage of the fabric that was already coming through New York and then sewn into clothes by people like Brooks Brothers. And of course, printing and publishing was there because the big money in 19th century publishing in the US was in pirated English novels. Right? There is no Asian, theft of American copyright today who had anything on our boys in the 1820s. Now, the big thing about publishing pirated novels is you really have to print it first. Right? There's no percentage in having the 8th pirated edition of Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. You've really got to get the thing and flood the market with it. Now, this gives a huge advantage to the principal port, because, in fact, the Harper brothers could get the latest Sir Walter Scott novel, could get Peveril the Peak off the boats 4 days before it would even show up at their Philadelphia competitors, Carey and Lee, and they could, in fact, print the thing in 24 hours. Good luck getting that from any university press today. But they could, in fact, flood the market with this book and put their competitors out of business. Again, in this case, the city was actually speeding the flow of information as well as speeding the flow of goods. Chicago's great industry was the stockyards. The stockyards were solving the problem of moving corn over space. America has always been fantastic at growing corn. We have this natural comparative advantage, right? Even without utterly benighted Department of Agriculture subsidies for corn growing. I'm sorry, that was completely unnecessary, editorial aside. But even without these utterly benighted subsidies, we would be great at doing this. But the problem with corn is it's expensive to ship. The stuff rots. It has a very low value per ton. So you have to transform it into something. In the early days, Philadelphia farmers transformed corn into whiskey, which is portable, potable, often tasty. Then the farmers of the Ohio River Valley would transform corn into salted pork. Pigs are, of course, corn with feet. And for some odd reason, human beings have long had a preference for salted pork over salted beef, which is why Cincinnati in the 1830s and 1840s was America's porkopolis. And then, of course, Chicago. The great innovation in Chicago is refrigerated rail cars, associated above all with this guy, Armour, right, who actually figures out that you put the ice blocks on top of the dressed beef rather than below it, keeping it cold during the long voyage on the rail cars east. Right? And so the stockyards are this great industry that's really about moving corn over space. Now, of course, the remarkable thing about cities, even cities like Chicago, and I'll come back to this later, is that even when they're built on these operations research type stories, which is, a lot of the story behind, let's say, the growth of Shenzhen today, cheap labor, easy access to infrastructure. When smart people are connected with each other, miraculous things still happen. 15th century Florence, a city built on banking and wool, also creates, through this chain of collaborative genius, the Italian Renaissance, right? Brunelleschi figures out the basic mathematics of linear perspective. He passes it along to his friend Donatello, who puts it in low-relief sculpture on the wall of Orson Michele, passes it along to Masaccio, puts it in painting on the wall of the Brancacci Chapel, marvelous picture of St. Peter finding a silver coin in the belly of a fish, passes along to Fra Filippo Lippi, that less than holy monk, passes along to Botticelli and so forth. A chain of genius, each person riffing on each other's ideas. So it was in Chicago as well, where a chain of genius that starts with William LeBaron Jenney, but goes through Daniel Burnham, goes through Adler, goes through Root, goes through Louis Sullivan, figures out how to make skyscrapers and make them work. This is what makes cities magical. This is what makes them important. In 1890s, 10 years later, it was mass-produced cars in Detroit, a chain of genius. The Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar Buick, Ransom E. Olds, Billy Durant in nearby Flint, and of course Henry Ford himself. All of them borrowing each other's ideas, buying parts from each other, using each other's financing, collectively creating this miraculously cheap thing. Now the problem is that the Ford vision creates this industrial city, a city built on large-scale industry. And the 20th century killed off these cities. In some sense, the right way to think about this is in 1900, Detroit was a very natural place to put an industrial empire because of those access to those waterways and those rail yards. Over the course of the 20th century, transportation costs in the US became irrelevant. This is the real cost of moving a ton a mile by rail, which declined by 90% over the course of the 20th century. So whereas at the start of the 20th century, firms and cities located in places where there was a transportation cost-based advantage, in Pittsburgh, near to the coal mines, right? In Chicago, near to the waterways. By the end of the 20th century, that became irrelevant. And so we moved to places where people wanted to live. The rise of the consumer city was born, something that the countries of India and China are not yet rich enough yet to have. But it is something that is coming, that will be coming, and it certainly has shaped America's cities. and I think perhaps the most obvious impact of this is the rise of warm cities. For there's no variable that better predicts metropolitan area growth in the 20th century in the US than January temperature, right? Some part of this is about things other than just liking warmer winters, right? So some part of this is about that you have relatively more pro-business regulations in right-to-work states. The work of the economist Tom Holmes compares counties on pro-business with counties on pro-labor sides of the same state line and finds a huge difference in industrial growth after 1947 in the pro-business states. Some part of this is about housing regulations. You don't understand why Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Phoenix, as metropolitan areas each added 1 million people between 2000 and 2010 without understanding that these places make it astonishingly easy to mass produce affordable housing for ordinary Americans, which is one form of inclusivity, by the way, one form to think about. But of course, as we've just been through the winter we've just been through, it's also a little about the temperature, that's what those Midwestern farmers were going to when they moved to Los Angeles. This is the same relationship between January temperature and population growth over the last decade in the EU. You see exactly the same pattern, right? Strong positive movement towards areas that are warmer. Along with the move to sun was the move to sprawl. We have always built our urban areas around the transportation technology that was dominant in the era in which they were being created. Our oldest urban spaces are, of course, walking spaces with narrow streets and short blocks like Beacon Hill. We then built spaces around streetcar suburbs. We built spaces around elevated rail lines. And, of course, we built spaces around the car. Spaces like Levittown, spaces like the Woodlands outside of Houston. The fact that we so massively subsidized the car was a huge mistake, and it continues to be a huge mistake, right? This administration has more aggressively than anyone in history used general tax revenues as opposed to gas taxes to pay for highways in Montana, right? When this administration talks about infrastructure, that is what they are talking about. Because once it goes through the Senate, it's on miles and miles of asphalt in the middle of the US, right? The impact of subsidizing highways is deeply harmful for cities. Right? Each new highway that cut into an urban core after World War II reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole, according to the work of Nathaniel Baum Snow. But we shouldn't be surprised that people like their cars. The average commute by car in this country is 24 minutes. The average commute by public transportation is 48 minutes. There's roughly a 15 to 20-minute fixed cost involved in going to and finding access to public transit. In case I don't get to this later, right, I think one of the great challenges of the 21st century is making buses cool. Because, in fact, buses are a marvelously flexible, cheap way to actually move people around. And indeed, they are indeed the great public transit technology that we have facing ahead of us in the developing world. Okay, in the move to sun and sprawl, cities imploded. This is the riot that destroyed much of Detroit in 1967. And I will just say, while I'm on the bus-train margin, that we also, as a country, engaged a Potemkin village strategy that acted as if the real city was somehow their physical structures or infrastructure, rather than the people that use that infrastructure. And when I think about the inclusive city, one of the most central things is that we need to design our buildings and our infrastructure in a way that provides real value for people, not in a way that makes star architects feel good about their products, nor in a way that allows urban mayors to celebrate some great new infrastructure project, right? Because there's no area in which it's easier to waste billions of dollars than a poorly designed, you choose it, light rail system or monorail system. This is Detroit's people mover monorail, right? Detroit, the hallmark of declining cities like Detroit is it is easy to get around them. These streets are empty, right? You can run buses at 60 miles an hour on dedicated lanes in Detroit with no cost whatsoever. The last thing in the world you need is a monorail to go above these empty streets. And yet exactly this is where the political discourse got us, because of a monumentalist approach to city building that was not tied to what the kids of Detroit needed, which was better schools and safe streets. Now, of course, some of our cities did come back. We're living in one of them. 40 years ago, two jokers put up a sign on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to leave town to please turn off the lights. Because no one could imagine Seattle, given that Boeing was cutting back on the number of jobs. Before Amazon, before Microsoft, before Costco, Starbucks is at best the faint whiff of an aroma in someone's nostrils, right? Entrepreneurship and smart people brought Seattle back. Boston's success is intimately tied to its universities. The work of Enrico Moretti, a Berkeley economist, shows that having a land-grant college in your metropolitan area prior to 1940 is a very strong predictor of urban resilience over the last 20 or 30 years. Boston's land-grant college, of course, is MIT, right? A college supported with a federal land-grant, which I am very sad to say has played a far more central role in Boston's economic resurgence than Harvard has. This is Vannevar Bush, one of the great MIT scientists who bridged the academy and enterprise, founder of Raytheon. also the mentor of Fred Terman, who would go and use this model in his development of Silicon Valley. And this is actually not Arthur D. Little himself. You can tell that. I don't have a non-copyrighted picture of Arthur D. Little. This is the Arthur D. Little building in MIT. And he was a chemist who actually started the consulting company in Boston, putting together, for example, the R&D lab for General Motors. New York, of course, is about finance. 42% of payroll on the island of Manhattan is in finance and insurance, right? We shouldn't surprise us that finance is an urban industry. Given the great comparative advantage of cities in the 21st century is the ability to move knowledge. There is no industry in which a little bit of knowledge is worth more. This is one part of the inequality of cities. I personally think that New York's extreme dependence on finance is dangerous for the city in many ways. History has not been kind to one industry towns, but we shouldn't be surprised why New York has gone this way, why London has gone this way, because information is so valuable in this industry. I like this picture for two other reasons. This is, of course, the bullpen at Bloomberg City Hall. There are three things that are useful about this, one of which is that Bloomberg's terminals are a part of chain of innovation in Florence, in New York, kind of like the same one that happened in Florence 500 years ago, of innovations building on each other to create a more quantitative, more serious approach to thinking about risk and return. Second reason I like this is Bloomberg reminds us of Jane Jacobs' point, that cities are at their most creative when they involve leaps from one industry to the other. Bloomberg, of course, is not a financial billionaire. He's an information technology billionaire, right? And he's able to succeed so enormously, competing with the guys in Silicon Valley, because he has the knowledge that the city has given him, because he's run the tech operation at Salomon Brothers, because he's run their trading floor. The third reason I like this is the physical structure here. This Wallace office, which is, of course, based on the bullpen at Bloomberg LLP, which is based on the trading floor of Salomon Brothers. And when you think about trading floors, there's something deeply puzzling about them. Here you have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in any normal industry would sit like a university dean, surrounded by a vast office, protected by oaken desks, executive assistants of a variety of forms. And here they are on a trading floor. They're right on top of each other. They're sweating on each other. If Michael Lewis is to be believed, there's guacamole flying at all hours of the night and day. And yet, why are they? Why are they putting up with this? Well, trading floors have this structure because this is an industry in which knowledge is just far more valuable than space. And that's fundamentally why cities have come back, because knowledge is more important than space. And this is the answer to our riddle that we started the talk with, why globalization and new technologies have made cities more, not less vibrant. Because what these things have done is they've increased the returns to being smart. They've increased the returns to being innovative. And our greatest talent as a species is our ability to learn from the people around us, our ability to pick up information when we come out of the womb from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, even occasionally from our teachers. Right? Face-to-face contact isn't going away because of new technology. That's why Google didn't send everyone off to work in the wilds of Mountain View. They built the Googleplex. They bought 1 million square feet in downtown Manhattan. So why Marissa Mayer enforces people to come into Yahoo. Right? This is why trading floors have their structure. Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your topic. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. And we have evolved over millions of years to have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with each other. That's one of the great virtues of face-to-face contact. That's why great universities like Tufts aren't in any sense challenged by this world. And that's why, in fact, cities aren't in any sense challenged by this world. Of course, it does mean that the futures of cities are very unequal, both within cities, in the difference between those people who are able to benefit from being connected to those information networks, and across cities. For in fact, in the West, skills determine which cities have managed to come back or not. I've ordered counties on the basis of their share of the population with a college degree as of the year 2000. This is the most educated fifth. These are the least educated 3/5. Population growth is 4 times higher in the most educated fifth. This is a pervasive fact. You want to understand why Seattle looks different from Detroit? More than half of Seattle's adults have a college degree. 1 in 8 of Detroit's adults have a college degree. Both of them are exactly on the regression line of how they should be doing based on their education levels as of 1970 or 1960 or 1940. Boston is blessed because of a variety of historical reasons that we've been a very educated place, and that is why we've been able to come back. This is the relationship between per capita GDP at the metropolitan area level and share of the population with a college degree. There's something that economists call human capital externalities, which reflects the benefits that we have from being around skilled people who teach us stuff, as the great English economist Alfred Marshall talked about 120 years ago, that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. Right? Who employ us, who give us job opportunities even in a recession. Having smart neighbors is really valuable. As the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10%, your wages go up on average by 8%. Okay, now when you think about human capital, Surely the most important skills in a city are not those that are taught in a university, as much as academics we like to pretend otherwise. They're the streets that are learned, the skills that are learned on the streets. And certainly for the long-run resilience of a city, as the example of Seattle makes plain, nothing is more valuable than the talent or inclination to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and noting that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh even then. He argued that this was a reflection of New York's industrial history and Pittsburgh's, that New York's great industry had very few returns to scale, very few barriers to entry, so anyone with a good idea and a sewing machine could get started in this. Right? This led to a culture of entrepreneurship built around the garment sector, and those guys would go do something else, particularly when things went wrong in garments. They would start building skyscrapers, they would start movie studios, they would do any number of other things, whereas Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel, and U.S. Steel trained company men, and these guys were not resilient. It is remarkable, given how mediocre our measures of entrepreneurship are, that they are so powerful at predicting urban resilience. One of them is the share of employment in startups. This is just average establishment size. These are the places with the smallest average establishments. In 1977, on employment growth between 1970 and 2010, this is the places with the biggest establishments. Huge gap, right? Huge gap within cities, huge gap across cities, any way you want to look at it. And I can talk about the statistics, but I'm running out of time. We have an entrepreneurship gap in Boston. We have one of the largest average establishment sizes in the country in Suffolk County, right? That is part of what the Innovation District was about, was try to create a more innovative, more entrepreneurial city. It's great. It was a great program in many ways. In some sense, it was doomed to, it was guaranteed success because this real estate was just so valuable in a place like Boston. The real question is, can we have an innovation district in a place like Dudley Square? Can we have something like this that is about using the natural entrepreneurship in poorer parts of Boston, poorer cities? Most entrepreneurial place I've ever been in the world is in Mumbai, in the Dharavi slum area, right? A place that is just filled with human talent. A place where you just walk through and you see entrepreneur after entrepreneur doing things that the city has taught them are productive. But of course, after wondering at the marvels of Indian human capital, you then walk out into the street and you see a kid defecating in an unpaved road. And you know the electricity is intermittent. And it reminds you that there are demons that also come with density, that need to be tamed. That in fact, for our cities to be inclusive, we need effective government structures. We need effective public sectors to actually battle contagious disease, congestion, crime, and even to help promote affordable housing. That in fact, just as there's no atheist in a foxhole, there's no such thing as a sensible libertarian in the city. As easy as it is for urban governments to screw up with things like monorails, it is also absolutely vital that urban governments take on the issue of clean water. And this is indeed part of the problem that we have with the change in the growth of megacities. In 1960, this is the relationship between GDP per capita and urbanization. As you can see, to be poor was to be rural. There was no such thing as a poor, highly urbanized society in 1960. This shows the same relationship using 2010 dollars in both time periods. Down here, massive numbers of places like Gambia, Haiti, Liberia, Benin, of places that are both poor and urban. I think the natural reason for this is that the US could only become urban when it could grow enough food and when it could transport it, so that it wasn't 50% urbanized until the 1920s when our per capita incomes in modern dollars were $7,500. But Port-au-Prince could be fed with rice grown in Louisiana. It doesn't need an internal agricultural development, and so it could urbanize earlier. I think on net that is a blessing, but it creates the rise of places that are poor and poorly governed that are enormously urban, and that is the challenge. We cannot talk about inclusive cities unless we actually grope with the problem of clean water, right? Because there's no more important urban problem. In New York, in 1900, a boy born could expect to live 7 years less than the national average, right? This is the same thing was true in Elizabethan London. This is the death rates in New York over the past 200 years, right? Today, life expectancy is about 3 years longer in New York. That didn't happen by accident. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. It required a massive engineering solution. I'll skip over that. But attempts to do it on the cheap didn't work. It required building Croton aqueducts, and that's clearly what's necessary. Some things, like clean water, require large expenditures in a public-led solution. Some things, like highway congestion, we can't build our way out of it. There's something called the fundamental law of highway traffic, which is that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive. There's no way to actually solve this problem without charging people for the use of a valuable resource. This is what Singapore has been doing for since 1975, electronic road pricing, and here we have the second densest country in the world where driving moves quickly. The lowest hanging fruit for China's cities to become more livable today is to impose congestion pricing. It's the time to do it is now, before China doesn't have 60% of its population driving and when it is less than perfectly democratic. Affordable housing. This is the connection between density levels in 1996 and change in housing prices subsequently. All of the housing price growth has been in the densest areas of the US, right? This is an enormous challenge that Boston has. On one level, this reflects the success of our cities, the comeback of places like New York as places of both pleasure and productivity. On the other hand, we're risking becoming places that are affordable only to the very, very few. On this area, I am a fundamentalist in the sense that I believe in those economic purities of supply and demand. We can talk about providing a few affordable housing units, but there's fundamentally no solution for this other than building more housing. This is an area in which Jane Jacobs got it wrong. She looked at old buildings and new buildings and noticed that old buildings were cheap and new buildings were expensive, which led her to conclude that the path to affordability was to make sure that we didn't let anyone build any new buildings on top of old buildings. Well, how'd that work out in Greenwich Village? That work out well? Right? Greenwich Village, which was affordable when she lived there, when she fought to create it in a historic preservation district, townhouses now start at $8 million. Okay? This is what happens when we try to freeze cities in amber. We actually need to allow cities to grow and change if they are to provide affordable housing. This is the relationship between home prices and land use regulations. We regulate our cities into being unaffordable. Paris is beautiful, but it is an extreme version of this. Mumbai is even more tragic. Mumbai has labored, because of a foolish adoption of English land use planning policies, an average floor area ratio requirement of 1.25 downtown, 1.25 stories in this city. This is not just creating a city that's too expensive. This is a tragic destruction of what could be a very different place. Instead of building up, it sprawls out. Right? Instead of having people next to each other with urban spaces where people can walk, it has people dying every day on the trains as they get to downtown. This is an area in which more change is required. Now, I want to end with just one last anecdote on this. And one of the reasons why I think it is so important that we have urban policies that work for everything, urban policies that enable cities to grow, is cities are also good for the environment. That in fact, we often think about, we all read the Lorax and we think that it's some terrible thing when you build cities on top of areas. But in fact, building up is not the enemy of the environment. In fact, it's the friend of the environment, because it's the opposite of building out. And the story I like to tell is about a young Harvard College graduate who, on a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord. And he did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. But when he came to cook the fish into the chowder, the winds flicked the flame to the nearby dry grass, and a fire started, and an inferno eventually raged, burning up more than 300 acres of prime Concord woodland. In his own day, he was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord freemen called him a flibberty gibbet, which I think was pretty bad for 1844. And of course, they were right. It's hard to think of anyone who was living in Boston or Cambridge who did as much damage to the environment as this character did. Of course, today, he is sanctified as the patron saint of American environmentalism. He is Henry David Thoreau, whose book Walden appears to preach a gospel of what a swell thing it is for us to all live surrounded by nature. His own life, to me, teaches a different gospel. It teaches us that we are a destructive species, and if you love nature, you should stay away from it. As in, Thoreau would have done a great deal of good for nature if he had not gone out fishing in the middle of the woods. Now, I've got data behind this, of course. I've estimated together with Matthew Kahn carbon emissions associated with living in different parts of the country, and, areas that look brown are green, areas that look green are brown. And I know this personally because when I started acquiring small children about 8 years ago, I moved from here, where I had a relatively modest carbon footprint because I didn't drive long distances and I lived in a small house, to moving out here where I started to do about as much damage to the environment as Thoreau does, what with the house, despite the fact that I keep it at 43 degrees most of the winter, which my wife thinks is not my best attribute. Now, of course, if the great growing economies of India and China see their per capita carbon emissions rise to those seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by about 130%. If they stop at the level seen in wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%. Yet another reason to sort of get our urban policies in order and to make sure that we have urban policies that are not just for the many, for the few, but also for the many as well. And I think one of the final reasons to believe in an urban solution is that, yes, Kinshasa is a disaster in many ways, right? It's a public health disaster, it's a governance disaster, and it desperately needs a more effective public sector going forward. But I don't see any path towards a better government that doesn't run through cities. Certainly when we think about how this republic was created, right, it started with organization and coordination between people like Sam Adams and John Hancock right here in Boston. The city brought them together. And when we think about change, not all of which is positive, we still have to see how the events of Tahrir Square work out, but it happens through cities, right? This thing was called the Facebook or the Twitter revolution, but it wouldn't have happened if people had just unfriended Mubarak on their Facebook pages, right? They actually needed to show up in Tahrir Square and force the change, and this is something that cities have been doing for centuries. And I think it's the hope of having a more functional government that can care for all of its citizens, that to me is in some sense the greatest promise, the greatest hope of cities. Thank you for your time.